So this is a process of developing a detailed description of the project and the product from the requirements collected earlier. So it documents the features and functionality of the project, of the product, of the service, or the result. One of the main advantages of this is that, remember that you have collected requirements from different stakeholders. You just collected the requirements. You really do not know the status of your requirements. Some of them might be used, some of them might be dropped. But by the time you synthesize and come up with a definitive scope of the project, and then you share to all of them, everybody now has a clear idea of what you are working on the project. For example, one said paint it green, one said paint it blue. By the time you have the scope of the project and then you realize that you should prioritize painting it blue over painting it green, everybody, including the person who said paint it blue and the person who said paint it green, now understands that going forward in the project, green was stepped down, blue was adopted. So when you have the scope of the project, it ensures that everybody, all stakeholders understand what you are working towards, they have a common understanding of the scope of the project. Then the scope of the project controls what is in the project and what is not in the project. So you want to have clearly spelled, clearly drawn project scope boundaries. What is within the boundary is in the project, is in the scope of the project. What is outside the boundary definitely is outside the scope of the project. So give the customer no more, no less, no gold plating. So what are those things we have under the scope of the project? When you say you are defining scope, what are those things you want to get clarity on, that you want to extract from the requirements that you have gotten? You want to understand project objectives. Then, of course, the detailed requirements, project boundaries, the deliverables, and the specification of the deliverables. The deliverables and the specification of the deliverables. You want to understand acceptance criteria. Please note that acceptance criteria is a very important point here. Acceptance criteria is a very important point here. It's not just enough for you to know what to do. You also need to know how will you be evaluated. What can make it rejected? What will make it accepted? So it's very important, because when you have all of these things clarified, that's why you are managing projects the professional way. You don't want to leave things up for chance. You don't want it to be that it is when you have spent so much money, so much time, wasting so much resources, that's when the sponsor now tells you, no. Yes, I said you should do it this way, but this is not what I wanted you to create. This is not how I wanted it to look. So, right from before you start execution, you want to have clarity around, yes, you want me to do this. What will make you reject it? What will make you accept it? So you want to clarify all of this. And then your assumptions and constraints. So by now you should understand that you'll be inheriting a lot of this information from the charter. And then, of course, with the detailed requirements you have gotten around, that has given you more information about all of this. And then the known risks, your milestones, and your budget estimates. So, even from here, you should be able to understand that a lot of the processes involved in project management are interrelated. From this list of what you have in your scope, you realize that you cannot define your scope independently of risk matters. You can't define your scope independently of how you want to carry out cost matters, and many more. So this is an example. This is a sample project scope statement. You can see from here that there are various sections. Please note that it's not it's not just, it doesn't have to look like this. This is just highlighting some of the various main sections you have. Each of these sections could be paragraphs, pages, documents here and there. Okay? Now, let's discuss the distinction, the differences. What is a requirement and what is the scope? What is a requirement, or what are requirements and what is the scope? It's important to know that not all requirements will be eventually included in the scope of the project. Some of them could have been dropped. So requirements are those raw things you collected from stakeholders. The scope is what the project manager has been able to come up with after synthesizing, analyzing the requirements. So your defined scope process selects the requirements from all the list of all the requirements that have been collected. Of course, you don't do this alone. There are times in which you have to revert back to senior management to help you with managing conflicts, or revert back to the sponsor to help you with managing prioritization. Your scope is progressively elaborated. Detailed scope is created over several iterations. Your scope is not done it's not the discretion of the project manager to define the scope. So definitely your scope is coming from the requirements you have collected from your stakeholders. So if you have modifications in requirements, definitely there will be modifications in the scope of the project. If you have changes, if you encounter reasons for which what you have in your scope has to change, that is, maybe you have planned, you have come up with the scope, but the reality now differs from what you planned, definitely you have to come and change your scope. But don't forget, changing your scope would have to pass through established change control system. Part of the tools and techniques we saw earlier is product analysis. For projects with maybe a tangible product as a deliverable, you want to do some detailed analysis of the product. You want to translate high-level product description into tangible deliverables. Please remember I said it earlier that you have to be able to look behind the lines. You have to look beyond what you are seeing to have a good understanding that what exactly are the deliverables of this project. There are different techniques you use for this: product breakdown, system analysis, requirements analysis, system engineering, value engineering, earned value analysis. We'll discuss earned value analysis when we get to costs. So you also have alternative identification. This is a technique used to generate different techniques, methodologies that you want to use to execute and perform the work of the project. So one of the ways in which you can do product analysis is you do cost-benefit analysis. You want to compare the benefits of this particular approach to the costs that you would incur. Cost does not necessarily have to be in monetary terms. Resources to be used, opportunities to be forgone, the opportunity costs are also part of those things you want to factor in. So output here is your project scope statement that we described earlier. You want to put here, you have your project deliverables, the work required to create the deliverables, and then this enables the project team to perform detailed planning. It contains scope exclusion. You get your scope exclusion based on your definition of the boundary of the scope. So this is used to manage stakeholder expectation. This is important that you manage stakeholder expectation very well, because don't forget that some of your requirements will have to be stepped down because of conflict and many other reasons. So make it clear. Communicate very well with your stakeholders for them to know what was accepted, what was not accepted, That is what was included in the scope eventually and what was stepped down. So one of the advantages, one of the benefits of defining your scope is that beforehand, before you go into execution, you want everybody to know, okay, going forward, this is what we want to work towards in executing the project. So you identify those whose requirements were stepped down, get to know. Those whose requirements were accepted, get to know. So it helps you in determining project boundaries. Yeah, project boundaries. So you have product scope statement too. Just as you have the scope of the project, you also have the scope of the product that is containing the core features of the product of the project. So you have product scope description, product acceptance criteria, the project deliverables, the project exclusion, the constraints, and assumptions. When you have defined your scope, it might require you to update some documents. So like I said, this list is not exhaustive. In reality, you get to be able to do quite a number of possible things here. But some of them here are stakeholder register. As you are defining your scope, you might eventually get to even see more, know more stakeholders. One. Then two, in your stakeholder register that lists your stakeholders and other information about them, you want to go and update the stakeholder register to be able to indicate the particular requirements coming from them that were accepted to put into the scope. And then your requirements documentation. In your requirements documentation, when you have defined your scope, you want to go back to go and update your requirements documentation to say, okay, this is what made it into the scope, the status for each of them. And that's the same explanation for your traceability matrix. You want to update the status of the requirements and many more about the requirements. Okay, so let's discuss the differences between, in fact, differences and similarities between the charter and the scope. So what comes to your mind? Charter, scope, charter, scope, charter, scope. Are they related? What do they have in common? What are the differences between them? Okay, so let's discuss that now. Of course, you know that the charter is developed during the initiating stage of the project. The charter is developed during the initiating stage, but the scope is developed during planning. The charter contains high-level summary information. The scope contains detailed information. The charter is written by the sponsor or as delegated. The scope is always written by the project manager. But the similarity here is that both the charter and the scope have to be approved by the sponsor. And then another thing is that they are both progressively elaborated. This charter too could change during the project, and then when it does, of course, the project has to adjust to it. Just like the scope too can be progressively elaborated. So this is a depiction of this. You have the sponsor creating the charter, given to the project manager. The project manager uses the content of the charter to plan the project, creating the scope statement, the scope of the project essentially.